Welcome to OurSport. I'm your host Larry. My son John is doing the recording and editing. Week 4 of the 2019 college season is in the books, and OurSport has gone to our second road trip of the year to Gainesville, Florida. We watched and saw Tennessee get taken down by the Gators. We'll get to that game in a minute. Our inaugural episode is in the description box below. We encourage everybody to watch that to get an idea of what we're all about here. Normally we have somewhat longer segments on a few different subjects. This may be more of a potpourri episode because so much happened in this week. Let's start with the biggest game of the week so far, which was Notre Dame going to Athens to play Georgia. This is a highly anticipated game. One of the most expensive, I believe the most expensive ticket in college football so far this year. I will say this about Georgia. Let me go back to a game John and I went to last year. We went to South Carolina, to Williams-Brice Stadium to watch Georgia play there. And we had really good seats for this. We were lower level, about fifth row, and almost midfield. And there were a lot of times where we would have a direct, straight shot, a view of the line of scrimmage. And you could see Georgia line up. And on the offensive line, they are massive. This is one of the biggest offensive lines I've ever seen. 340-pound guards. I think Isaiah Wilson's 360-pound tackle. And that size showed in that game. As soon as the ball was snapped, you could see the Georgia line immediately move the South Carolina defensive front. That started early in that game, and what was kind of a cosmetically close score by the third quarter, Georgia just blew them out in the second half of that game. And this is what Kirby Smart does to virtually every opponent. He has a massive advantage on the line of scrimmage on offense, and he will get the ground game going, and he will wear teams out early and control the game. Now about Notre Dame. They came in, and their biggest weakness was supposed to be run defense. They lost a defensive tackle in the first round of the NFL draft, Jerry Tillery. They lost two really highly regarded linebackers for them, guys who played great, Drew Tranquill and Tavion Coney, to the NFL. And this was supposed to be their weakness. But they acquitted themselves really well in this game. They held up against the Georgia run game. Georgia was patient at it. The score was close enough that Kirby could do this. And by the third quarter, Georgia was starting to break some runs. This run game was starting to finally be effective. In the end, Notre Dame couldn't win the game. It was a one-score game, actually 6 points. They could have won with a touchdown, and it failed to come up when they needed with the win when they needed to. But if you look at it, they played much better, I think, than people thought. Everybody thought here in the Atlanta area, and there's a bit of homer bias to this, that Georgia was going to blow them out. But I'm not a Georgia fan, and I thought they were going to blow them out. I thought the skill level compared to these two teams, there was a gap. And there might be. But Notre Dame's coaching really showed itself well in this game. You have to give them a pretty good amount of credit. They're not going to be in our top 10, but this is about as good as you can play in a loss. This is a really tough home environment. When this was a night game, the crowd was a vast majority was Georgia fans. They didn't sell many tickets to this. It had a nightclub atmosphere, and it affected Notre Dame some on some of the penalties and false starts. Despite that, they were in this game till the very end. The Irish were. You can tell they're used to playing a lot of big road games. So Georgia's going to stay in our top 6. Notre Dame's going to be out of it, but they're kind of hovering around the outside of our top 10. And I wonder now what happens when Georgia plays teams with better talent than Notre Dame on our schedule. One of the things you notice at the Georgia receivers, they were making some plays. They're big, athletic receivers. But even when they were made plays, these were contested catches. Notre Dame's coverage was stout, and they were in position to defend these balls. They were very, very close to making plays on the balls, and they just couldn't. Well, Notre Dame's not the best secondary Georgia's going to play this year. They have Auburn on the schedule. Any potential matchup, they have Florida on the schedule as well. Florida's a first-round corner, C.J. Henderson. And any potential matchup Georgia has later in the SEC championship game looks almost certainly to be LSU, Alabama. Those are great secondaries. And those are teams that are going to be able to stop the run probably at least as good as Notre Dame did. So we'll see. I'm one of these people that's not impressed with Jake Fromm. People like Jake Fromm, and I just think he has a lot of help. He has a lot of talent around him, and to me, he's not nearly as good as Tua Tagovailoa at Alabama or even Joe Burrow at LSU. You look at his performance, 2 substandard performances in the fourth quarter in both games against Alabama. The national championship 2 years ago, the SEC championship last year. You look at the LSU game on the road last year. Georgia gets blown out on the road. He plays terribly in that game. If you look at the year before that, when Georgia was number 1 in the country, they went and played Auburn. John and I were at that game, and we go to a lot of games, you can tell. And he didn't play well in that game. Georgia got blown out again. He, to me, is considered a pro prospect, one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. The mantra is, he just wins. Well, of course he wins. Of course he wins. Because he's playing teams like a down Georgia Tech team that's completely outmanned. He's playing a directional school out of conference. He's playing Vanderbilt. Of course he's going to win against those teams. How could he not? You have an offensive line that's littered with NFL players and NFL running backs lining up almost like a factory. Sony Michel and Elijah Holyfield and now DeAndre Swift, and he has talent and depth all around him. He has as much help in a supporting cast as almost any player in college football. To me, he's not a next level quarterback. He does not make the players around him better. Doesn't mean that Georgia can't win the national championship. They're playing really well on defense. You look at the last snap Notre Dame had when they were trying to win, you would think Georgia might have been tired. They came off the ball in a flash. They got immediate pressure on Ian Book from Notre Dame, and they looked like a big, strong, well-conditioned team. This team has so much talent all across the board that they could have a caretaker type of quarterback and still win the national title. They're that good. Because really, that's what Alabama did for a long time. Players like Jake Coker, Greg McElroy, I would say A.J. McCarron was a little more than that, but even without him, they still won multiple national titles. Now, week 4 had a ton of crazy games. One of these Saturdays in college football that it becomes renowned for after a while, where the crazy just happens. You start flipping the dial on your remote, and everywhere you look, something eventful happens. The late game, UCLA at Washington State. Washington State's rivals in the Pac-12 used to have a term that Washington State fans hated, Couganing it. They would just say this because Washington State had a way of almost inventing ways to lose. Lose games in a strange fashion, in a John L. Smith and Michigan State type of fashion. And this was another one. You kind of thought that Washington State had gotten over this. Maybe not. They couged it in this game. They had a 32-point lead. They were winning 49-17, a lead that you almost wonder how you could blow a lead like this. And when you look at the stat sheet, it looks like a series of misprints. Washington State's quarterback Anthony Gordon, 570 yards, 9 touchdowns. The Cougars had 720 yards offense. How do you lose a game like this? And the answer is really turnovers. UCLA, they run tempo. They didn't run 110, 120 plays in this game. UCLA ran 75 plays in this game. But Washington State turned the ball over 6 times, -5 overall in turnover differential. And UCLA's yards per attempt, 13.4. So every time they got the ball back, UCLA was making huge plays. Now, some of the announcers are pointing to the fact that there was exhaustion. Washington State players were tired, and they had a habit of missing tackles. On the one punt return example, let me go back a little bit. Under Kevin Sumlin's last year at Texas A&M, it was laughable tackling, and I refer to it as slap tackling. That's the only thing I could think of to call it. They were literally just reaching their arms out and slap tackling people. And if you watch the punt return that UCLA had against Washington State, it's a series of flap tackles. They're simply trying to slap tackle the returner. Now, when you run 75 plays on offense, that's not enough to gas a defense. This is simply poor defensive performance. This is not fatigue. This is a defense that's simply not capable. And what you take from a game like this, I don't know. I think that this is a really great sign for UCLA, but going forward in the future, Yeah, this was just a Pac-12 game. It was really odd. I don't know what to make of it from either one of these teams. Maybe more so from UCLA, not so much from Washington State. We'll see as the season plays out for both of them. As I mentioned before, John and I had gone down to Ben Hill Griffin Stadium in Gainesville, Florida, also known as the Swamp. John was wearing the jersey of his favorite team, a Michigan jersey, and I was wearing a Michigan shirt. And the Florida fans were very polite. They were friendly to us. They let us frequently know the score of the Wisconsin game in case we couldn't follow it on the internet. They kept telling that score over and over again. They also were constantly reminding us that Michigan, if they were in the SEC, would go 0-12. I thought that was pretty unfair. I thought the worst they could do is probably 0-8, which would be likely if they were in the SEC. Let's get to this game. If you see this score, a lot of people, I'm sure, did not follow this game because there were better games going on, and Florida pulled away. Florida's a top 10 team. They won this game convincingly on the scoreboard, but we watched the whole game. Florida is not a top 10 team. Tennessee, their biggest issue is not effort. Their biggest issue on defense, first of all, is that they are not well coached. Jeremy Pruitt cannot adjust. Florida found a weakness in the middle post. They would throw the post pattern in the middle of the field, and they exploited this over and over and over, and Tennessee took too long to adjust, and that's how the Gators pulled away from them. Until then, when they weren't doing this, Florida was kind of going in fits and starts. They were not a smooth, consistent offense churning out first downs. Tennessee on offense, meanwhile, was terrible. They were terrible on offense. They were similar to Florida, fits and starts, except they never hit any big plays. They have some skill at receiver. Their biggest issue is quarterback. They have to have a better quarterback than Jared Guarantano. So Florida won this because they just exploited a mismatch in terms of Tennessee coaching. Florida up ahead is going to play teams better than this. Florida, we talked to the fans, a lot of them, and the universal thought was they all know. They know Florida's not a top 10 team. They know despite their ranking, they're playing too many close games. Now, with Florida's schedule, they're going to have teams that they're better on throughout most of their schedule. But the Florida fans told us, it's like, we know what happens when we play Auburn. We know what happens when we play LSU and Georgia. They expect to lose those games. So despite how it looks, and Tennessee's going to be, Florida's going to be ranked in the top 10 after this game. They're going to be ranked in the AP or the coaches. They're not going to be in our top 10. And we know they have a good record, but we watched them play on the field. We saw them with our own eyes, and this is not what a top 10 team looks like. Tennessee, on the other hand, is terrible. They are terrible. They have some talent. They do play with good effort, but their consistency on offense is terrible. They cannot run the ball, and they have good effort on defense, and they have some big talented players, but they are being hindered on the sideline. And if it goes like this, I don't expect Jeremy Pruitt to be coaching after this year at Tennessee. Let's talk about a coach that's flying completely under the radar, that nobody's talking much about. I think he's doing a really good job. We're talking about Chris Creighton at Eastern Michigan. I'm not talking about Michigan. I'm talking about Eastern Michigan, 7 miles down the road from the University of Michigan in Ypsilanti. And this is a program that before Creighton got there, in the 10 years before he got there, they had 25 wins. In the 5.5 that he's been there, he has 25 wins already. These are not great numbers until you look at it in context. His first 2 years there, they go 3-21. It's very much par for the course, as it had been the decade before. He's building the program. Then they go 7-6, 5-7, 7-6. Now, even those records, the 7-6 and 5-7 and 7-6, were different when you start to look at them. He has a very limited amount of talent to work with in this area. Of course, you have to understand that. And they're going to lose games and get blown out at times. And that was the case. But what started to happen is at the end of the 2016 season, they had a game against Northern Illinois. And they lost close. And their record is somewhat similar, But now you start to look at the margins of their wins and their losses. And since that point, 2016, instead of getting blown out in their losses, they have this amazing series of close losses to go with the wins that they're piling up. What does that mean? Well, he's 16-16 now over his last 32 games, a 500 record. This is a pretty good coaching job that he's doing for a place like Eastern Michigan, which might have historically some of the least talented rosters in a very below average conference like the MAC. So he's going 16-16. But hypothetically, if you look at the scores, if they had simply been one score better, if you simply add one touchdown on their scores in their last 32 games, you're talking about a team that would have gone 25-5-2. 25-5-2 at Eastern Michigan. Two of those who would have had a tie that, what would have happened? Let's see, even if they lost, it was in overtime. He's talking about 25-7. So nobody's noticing the job that he's doing. They play on a strange gray field. This is kind of a marketing gimmick of theirs. And when you see it, it kind of throws your eyes off. It's like watching football from the 1940s. And yesterday they played Central Connecticut. And of course, the competition, it's Central Connecticut. It's not even an FBS program. But they find ways to win. Eastern Michigan was losing this game by 1 point. And with 18 seconds left, they block a punt for a touchdown to beat Central Connecticut. Creighton being inventive, developing talent. A few years ago, he put Darius Jackson, running back, 1,000-yard rush into the NFL. They've got a great senior quarterback, Mike Glass. Had a pretty good season last year, limited playing time. He's a full-time starter here this year. And this is a coach to watch because he will not be at Eastern Michigan much longer. Somebody, somewhere, will see the job he's doing and will snatch him up. Can he win a conference title? That's difficult. You look at some of the teams they play, even in their own conference, like Toledo and Northern Illinois, still have a level of talent above theirs. But they're in almost every game. And when you look over the last 3 years, he's won on the road in the Big Ten against Big Ten teams 3 years in a row. Beat Rutgers 2 years ago. Beat Purdue on the road last year. This is a Purdue team that smashed Ohio State. Of course, we're talking about the transitive property, so it doesn't apply, but he still beat them. And this year, of course, he goes on the road and beats Illinois. So 3 Big Ten victories on the road in 3 years at one of the most downtrodden programs in the MAC. I think a smart athletic director will pluck Chris Creighton out of here, and he shouldn't be here after this year. This is a hot coach. This is a coach that knows what he's doing. He's somebody to watch. So if you look here, you see our top 10. And the top 6 mostly have remained unchanged. I had said in the last episode that there seemed to be a clear separation from the top 6 from the teams behind them. Even more of a separation than there are from top teams normally. Instead of a notch, maybe 2 full notches. And it looks like these teams are invincible, but thinking back on it, I was probably wrong. Because this is what college football is. College football does not follow chalk. College football does not go the way it's supposed to. We are in week 4 of the season. There are 2 bye weeks. This is a pretty long season. And a lot of times when a team is upset, it's not a 10-0 team losing to an 8-2 team. It's a team that comes out of the blue to beat these great teams. Oklahoma State going on the road to Iowa State. I believe the team that Iowa State that beat them on a Friday was a 4-8 team. Clemson losing to Syracuse a few years ago. Syracuse ended up being 4-8 and beat Clemson. So that it's not in stone that these teams are going to continue on their charted path until they encounter one of the other teams in the top 6. Somebody here is going to get upset. We don't know where. We don't know yet, but it's such a long season. You have 18, 20-year-old kids, and really you have college kickers. That's always a big factor too. I want to talk about Auburn real quick. You'll see them at number 7 on here. Auburn's got a couple of big wins now. They got that win over Oregon the week 1, and they went to Texas A&M. And if you watch the first play of the game, you'll see why Gus Malzahn, he can do some good things. They go on the road. There's 100,000 people in that stadium. That's a great stadium. It's on our list. We're going to get there one day. And if you watch the first play, Gus has a reverse. He has a handoff right. It's the first play of the game. A&M's all excited. The crowd is with him. They bite on that handoff right, and then he runs a reverse off at left. Well, that reverse is to Anthony Schwartz. And Anthony Schwartz is almost certainly the fastest player in all of college football. There's talk he's going to be trying to qualify for the Olympics as a track athlete. And so the entire defense runs right and he runs left and he simply blazes by them. Schwartz is a fascinating player. He's going to miss some time because anytime he gets any kind of injury, he doesn't play. Any kind of lower body injury especially, it limits his effectiveness. But he is so explosive, and you're talking about a guy, if he went to the combine, would run probably a legitimate 4.3 or under. You always hear announcers say that this guy runs a 4.42, this guy runs a 4.4, and the guys like that don't run 4.4. Well, guys not like Anthony Schwartz, he does. But whenever they say that, they go to the combine, that guy runs a 4.4, he ends up running a 4.6. The people, if you look, that actually run a 4.4, there's usually about a handful of them at any one point coming into any draft class. 5, 6, 7 of them. And to run a legitimate 4.4. And Anthony Schwartz is probably going to run pretty well under that. You're talking about a guy with literally world-class speed. Auburn's intriguing. Have Alabama, Georgia, and LSU on your schedule. That is so brutal, but you know, the Oregon and A&M games were tough, and those were the other two hurdles that were on our schedule beside the 3 coming up. I don't know if Auburn can go undefeated, but I can see them getting somebody. I could see them ruining somebody's season. So that's a team I definitely want to keep an eye on. So thanks for joining us this week. I'm Larry. As I said, my son John helps. He does the recording and he puts all the videos and images in. He does the vast majority of the work, really. I just talk. Join us on our Facebook group, OurSport College Football. Contact us at OurSport150@gmail.com and find us at OurSport3 on Twitter. We're user-friendly. We want to help our fans. If you have any requests, if you have any questions, ask us. And if you want us to talk about your team, tell us, because we'll probably do it. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.